Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, the Answer Company. The division championship Minnesota Twins are looking to go all the way to the World Series in 2024. Bolstered by inspirational shortstop Carlos Correa, a healthy Brian Buxton, and rookie phenom Royce Lewis, plus a pitching staff led by Pablo Lopez and an outstanding bullpen featuring Johan Duran, the Twins are the best bargain in the major leagues, and Target Field is the best venue in baseball. Sheridan Dulas & Kins, PA, a family and criminal defense law firm, has been serving clients in Dakota County and throughout Minnesota for over 40 years. Ranked a Tier 1 Best Law Firm by U.S. News and World Report every year since 2009, Sheridan Dulas & Kins are here to help you in your most difficult life circumstances. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Welcome to Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. Thank you for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to welcome back to our studio today our resident legal eagle and political analyst, our friend Professor David Schultz of Hamline University and the University of Minnesota Law School. Professor Schultz, David, welcome back to Access to Democracy.
Thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So we are just a few days past an historic presidential election. The polls prior to the election told us it was going to be a nail-biter. We were going to be up all night and possibly not know the results of the election for several days. That didn't happen. Donald J. Trump, former president, will be the next president of the United States come January 20th. How did that happen?
Well, first off, I want to throw out a number. Remember, this is a number that is just a few days after the election, and the number is 135,000. And people are saying, what's that number represent? That if you looked at the election across the three critical swing states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, had Vice President Harris picked up 135,000 more votes across those three states, she would have won. I just mention that because on one level, it wasn't a nail-biter. On the other hand, what people don't realize is how close this election actually was in some ways, is that the Democrats across the country lost by about 1 percentage point in critical Senate races, in critical congressional races, but because they consistently lost by about 1% across all of them, and because it's winner take all, it really has consequences in terms of what it means. But I pointed out to people that 8 years ago, had Secretary Clinton received 90,000 more votes in 3 states, she would have been president. 4 years ago, had Donald Trump received 43,000 more votes in 3 states, he'd be president. We're continuing a trend of close elections, but the problem is for Democrats, they're on the losing end of all the close elections now, and there are trends that are suggesting that this may not be good for them.
She didn't win any of the battleground states.
Correct.
She lost the big 3 that everyone was talking about, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But also when you went to North Carolina and Georgia, there was some hope that perhaps she'd pull a win off there. She did not. Donald Trump won there. And he also won, I believe, Arizona and Nevada.
Absolutely.
So it seems to me, looking at the election data post-election, one of the most stunning things is that her margins were actually worse than Joe Biden's. And in particular communities, say a word about that, if you will, about how the demographics of this election broke down in terms of how women voted, how Hispanic and Latino voters voted, and African American voters.
Sure. A couple of observations. First off, I'll say the blue wall is no more. The blue wall fell down. The blue wall reference to Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that collapsed. But if we think of the Democratic Party as being the party of women, the party of persons of color, and the party of, let's say, working class, they lost ground in all of those situations here, is that we saw Hispanic and African American, especially males, moving away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. We saw a continued exodus of working class America in general away from the Democratic Party. And even in the critical suburbs, places like Bucks County and in a lot of suburbs across the United States, women who the Democrats were counting on because of the abortion issue to vote for them moved away from the Democratic Party. And I'm going to offer an explanation as to why. A combination of disconnect and also, I would say, taking voters for granted. In terms of the disconnect, one of the messages that the Democrats have been talking about is that the economy is great, the economy's great. And maybe the economy's great on Wall Street. Maybe it's okay on Main Street. But if we can describe, let's say, where people live as Elm Street, it wasn't so good. And what I mean by that, people are looking at the price of milk, bread, eggs, infant formula, and it's a lot more expensive than it was before. So when Biden and then Harris are saying the economy is great, people are saying maybe on Wall Street, maybe on Main Street,
but not on my street.
Not on my street, it's not. And so there was this kind of like a disconnect. And with that disconnect, there was a sense in which kind of a credibility gap. The Democrats weren't talking about the issues that average people were concerned about.
To your point, Senator Bernie Sanders, the day after the election, made an interesting comment. He said, it should come as no surprise that when the Democratic Party has abandoned the concerns of working people, that working people would abandon the Democratic Party. That was his assessment of this election. How close to the mark do you think Senator Sanders is?
I think he's very accurate, but I also think he's making an accurate statement that goes back 50 years. I think what happened in 2016, 2020, and 2024 was the product of 50 years. 50 years of the Democrats taking for granted that African Americans would vote for them, taking for granted that working class would vote for them, while at the same time we saw the gap between the rich and poor go to unprecedented levels. That for many African Americans, they look at the schools that their kids go to and they're still not strong. They look at the problems that they face on a day-to-day basis and ask, what have the Democrats done for me recently? And so Trumpism, if I can describe it as the movement that supports Trump, built on economic frustration, built on what is apparently for many voters now, Democrats taking him for granted. And so even though in 2020 Biden wins, I think he mostly won because of the pandemic. His win temporarily blocked Trump. But what we saw here is that all those trends that the Democrats had been seeing erosion of their support really came home to roost, again, across the board. And we saw with all their critical constituencies, a shift away from the Democrats and a shift to the right. The Democrats probably needed to be talking about working class issues 50 years ago. And the question is, how long is it going to take for them to start to talk about them again and before they can bring them back home? It's going to be a long haul strategy.
There's a lot of finger pointing going on right now within the Democratic Party about how this could happen. There were many people who were convinced that Kamala Harris was going to win, was going to be the first Black, Asian American, and the first woman president of the United States. Obviously, that didn't happen. One of the criticisms I've heard is that Joe Biden should have stuck to what he said in 2020. I'm going to be a transitional president. I'm going to serve one term and be out, which would have created a pathway 2 years rather than a condensed campaign in the space of a few months. Do you think there's merit to that criticism, and do you think it would have changed the outcome had Joe Biden announced after the 2022 midterms that he was not going to run for re-election?
Possibly. I wonder if any Democrat could have won this year, given sort of the longer term trends that we're thinking about here, especially with a message that didn't resonate with the working class. But yeah, most of us thought, and Biden had said that he was a transitional president, that I think most people were expecting that sometime right after the midterm elections in 2022, we would start to see a whole host of people run for election or run for presidency. Maybe it would have been Newsom, maybe Buttigieg, maybe who knows other people who would have been out there. And
they would have been tested by a lengthy primary process.
Right. Now we can question whether or not we need that length of a primary, but certainly his saying he was going to stay in short-circuited the ability of Democrats to be able to vet the strongest candidate. And one of the other criticisms I've heard now is that when he did announce that he was stepping aside, endorses Harris, and she very quickly gets the nomination, one of my students said it well, and they said, well, she just got anointed by the leadership of the Democratic Party as opposed to being selected by the people. She never vested herself with the people, never vetted herself, and they never vetted her. And so there was the sense in which, yet again, the average voter didn't have a say in what the Democrats were doing at the top. And so I think that was a problem. I also think the fact that the Democrats banked too much on the abortion issue, banked too much on the idea.
In light of the Dobbs decision of the Supreme Court, they thought this is going to be the issue that turns women out, except a lot of women still voted for former President Trump.
Right, because they looked at their pocketbook issues. I want to tell this story. I live in the Midway area of St. Paul, and about 2 weeks before the election, I was at a grocery store up there kind of buying my stuff, whatever, and there was a woman in front of me who bought 6 of these containers of powdered infant formula. Cash register rung up, it was over $140. Now, I had no idea how much infant formula costs. I looked at it. This woman looked at it.
You were shocked.
I was shocked. This woman said, I can't afford this. She put it back and came back and bought a case of ramen noodles for her family, including probably for her kid. She was a person of color. She was female. I doubt if she voted, she was going to vote for Kamala Harris. Because for her, what the economy meant was the fact that she couldn't afford the infant formula for her kids. And until Democrats start talking about those issues and start listening, they're not going to win. The one thing that I will give Donald Trump credit for the last 8 years, is that he gives legitimacy to workers' grievances. He listens to them, or at least goes through them, through listening to them. Whether or not he does anything to help them is a different story entirely. But they feel like they have a voice. Somebody who is out there for them. And right now, I don't think many workers feel like the Democrats are giving them that voice and that space. The Democrats are talking about abortion. They're talking about transgender issues. They're talking about LGBTQ issues. Those are all important. But remember James Carville's great line from 1992?
It's the economy, stupid.
Yeah. It's always about the economy. It's always about the pocketbook issues.
And the post-election polling certainly supports that idea, the exit polling saying people were voting on the economy. Let's shift our focus from the national level and bring it home, closer to home here. Here in Minnesota, it seemed to be at the federal level anyway, a very good night for incumbents. Senator Amy Klobuchar in a race that really wasn't a contest, won overwhelmingly, won re-election to her U.S. Senate seat. All of the incumbents in the congressional delegation, including here in the 2nd District, Angie Craig, and in the 3rd District, Democratic seat that was opened by Dean Phillips leaving, filled by State Senator
Kelly Morrison.
Kelly Morrison won that seat. Minnesota has changed demographically. Republicans picked up their share of the vote in the presidential race. It seems that Kamala Harris won Minnesota, but by about half the margin that Joe Biden did just 4 years ago. He won the state by 7 to 8%. She won it by only 4%. Some people are saying Minnesota is going to be a battleground in the next presidential race. Do you think that's true, or is it too early to tell?
Well, first off, the good answer is always it's too early to tell. That's always a good answer. But we've been becoming a battleground state for quite a few years. The number of people who identify as Democrat versus Republican, that gap has narrowed. As we saw in this election now, we have an end to the trifecta where now the House is going to be with
67 to 67, it looks like.
That's right.
Right.
And we have a lot of indications that the state is becoming more conservative. If we look at the 87 counties that exist in Minnesota, we're down to now in this election only 9 counties voted for Democrat. Were voted for Democrats. So things have really shifted quite a bit. And even if I want to come back to Klobuchar, her margin of victory, given the candidate she ran against, she should be a little bit worried about that. She ran against an incredibly weak candidate who even the Republican Party disavowed. And her margin of victory this time was much less than it was.
56%, I
Yeah,
believe.
much less than it was before.
She was over 60% in
Consistently
previous
over
races.
60, yeah. So I think she even has to worry a little bit too about the fact that, again, running against a very weak candidate. Waltz himself, I think, needs to be concerned. If we look at when he ran for governor the first time, governor the second time, and now for vice president, these are all three statewide offices, his percentage of the popular vote has gone down consistently. These are not good signs for Democrats because their base is contracting. Granted, it's an area that's where most of the population is, but their base is contracting, the party IDs are shifting, and Minnesota could very well be a real battleground state.
Where the candidates are going to be spending
Sure.
as much time here as they did in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania.
Exactly.
That'll be interesting to see. At the state legislative level, we should mention too that the DFL appears to have held on to the Senate by 1 seat. There
That's
was
right.
a special election.
That's right.
Senate wasn't up this year, they're up in 2 years. But there was one special election, so the Democrats eked that out.
Right.
So
and they were lucky that the rest of the Senate wasn't up because
Right.
I could have seen a scenario if they were, they could have lost control of the Senate.
So it would beg the question, David, do you think, a couple of questions, do you think Democrats are up to retooling their party to appeal to working class voters, to appeal to more voters in rural areas, which the Democrats, we used to have a legislature that had people from rural areas. Northeastern Minnesota used to be solidly blue, and labor was a big part of that foundation. Now it's solidly red.
Yeah.
35% margin for Donald Trump in the presidential election. Are Democrats up to revamping their approach to politics in a way that will yield benefits in the future, or do you think this is a losing proposition?
How about option 3? Even if they want to make that shift, I don't think they can right away. And the reason why is that it's really locked into now in Minnesota. It's really the Minneapolis and St. Paul and maybe the inner ring suburbs that are the core for the Democratic Party now. They're representing a set of interests that are far to the left than the rest of the state. And to basically tell those groups to say, you've got to take a back seat on a variety of issues, and we have to compromise in order to win, would make sense if we lived in a rational world, but we don't live in a rational world. I tell a story that a couple of years ago, my wife and I went up to Eveleth, up to the Iron Range area. Had never really gone up there, wanted to go see the Hockey Hall of Fame, things like that. And outside of every establishment was a sign that said, support mining. And I say that because the Twin Cities liberals all are saying, can't have mining, bad for the environment, going to court litigating it. For up there, mining equals jobs. Mining is about a livelihood. And for them, these were Democrats who are listening to the urban Democrats say, no jobs, no mining. It's not a message that they want to hear. Now, I don't know what the right answer is.
But to be fair, a little bit of pushback on that. To be fair, there are serious concerns about copper mining
There's no
on
question.
the periphery of the Boundary Waters Canoe area.
There's no question.
So it's a very tough balancing act. And so if it's opposing mining, I guess it would beg the question, what else are Democrats going to offer people in those areas
And that's
for
exactly my
jobs?
point. That's exactly my point here, is that if you're going to say we're not going to help you with mining, what is the alternative economic development plan you have for this area? And that's what I was really getting at here.
Yes.
But right now, what it's being pitted as is jobs versus environment. It is rural Minnesota against urban Minnesota. And even within the Democratic Party, or what was the Democratic Party, you're not getting a dialogue between the urban areas and the rural areas. And the Democrats certainly can't reach out to working class if they can't even reach out to within their traditional grouping of Democrats who were with them for many years.
Mm-hmm. How likely do you think it is that with a closely divided legislature that they actually are going to try to find some issues where there's common ground so that they can both come away and say, we each got something. We didn't get everything we wanted, but we each got something. How likely is that? Or are we going to see them maybe cooperate for a little while and then go their separate ways?
Yeah, I think there's going to be some cooperation initially, but then it's going to break down because the interests in both parties are so polarized and so in opposition. But there's one thing they're going to have to come together for. This is the session where the biennial budget is done. They have no choice but to come together. Now, I'll make an easy prediction unless I'm totally wrong here. My easy prediction will be we're going to go into special session. And we've done that for many, many years in a row, that the budget has to be done by the end of the legislative session, which will come, mid-May. I don't think we're going to have a budget at that point. We're going to be into a special session, and we're going to probably go right up to the wire. And the reason why I say that is that the Republicans want some things. After being locked out for the last couple of years, they're going to want something, whether it's in the budget, whether it is getting the Democrats to revisit things like paid family leave or whatever it may be. And so even though the Republicans don't have enough votes to pass anything, they have enough votes to veto things.
That's an interesting point. I heard State Representative Lisa DeMuth, who of course is the Republican leader in the Minnesota House, saying that, well, there are some things we need to revisit. We need to tweak a couple of issues having to do with the cannabis legislation that was passed. We need to tweak a few things on health care. So those are the types of issues you're talking about where they maybe don't have the power to get everything they want, but they have the power to stop something.
Right, and then combining that with the fact that the Democrats are going to need at least one Republican vote to pass the budget, at the very least, assuming they can go straight party line otherwise. The Republicans have an enormous amount of leverage to force a rethinking of some of that old legislation and to also force going forward how the state's going to handle the budget and a variety of issues. And so this is going to be very, very interesting. It's also going to be interesting to see who's in what position. What happened in the last time this happened in 1979, it was the Democrats got the speakership, the Republicans got chairs of all major committees. I'll be curious to see who emerges. Are we going to see, who are we going to see as the next Speaker of the House? There's only one. You can't have two.
Right.
And who's going to have what committee chairmanships or chairs at this point? These are all really fascinating questions that are going to unfold over the next few weeks.
So it'll be interesting to see, do the parties actually see an opportunity here to try to get something done so that they can both go to their respective constituencies and say, look, we actually delivered something?
In a rational world, yes. We're going to see. We're going to see.
But in a political world, all bets are off.
All bets are off. They might do that for the first couple of weeks, first 2 to 3 weeks, and maybe even a bit longer. But once the budget comes out, once we start talking about funding programs or taxes, the proverbial, that's where the rubber hits the mat at that point, and we will see what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen at this point in terms of how cooperative. 1979 is eons ago from now, when we were a less polarized society. It's going to be an interesting ride.
And we didn't have in 1979 this proliferation of social media.
Correct.
And angry media, if you will, that
Exactly.
inflames the passions of people, that drives political leadership to the extremes on both the right and the left.
Exactly, yeah. And that's going to make it harder for both sides to compromise, because you're going to have the social media, the echo chambers on each side saying, dig in, dig in, dig in,
Right.
don't compromise. And what you need at some point is a little bit of breathing room to be able to compromise. And I'm just not sure that's going to exist here.
David, I want to ask you your thoughts about President President-elect Trump's legal situation in light of the election. The special prosecutor is already negotiating with the Justice Department about how to wrap up his investigation for election interference and classified documents that the former president took with him to Mar-a-Lago after his first term ended. Looks like those federal cases are going to go away. But that's not necessarily true with the state cases. Is that correct?
That is correct. So he's awaiting sentencing in New York on the 34 felony convictions. He's going to be sentenced in the next few weeks. I can see the judge doing something like a fine or a probation. And
he's not going to prison.
He was never going to go to prison. This was a fantasy that some people had. And in Georgia, I suspect there will be a request to delay the trial, drop charges. This is for election interference in Georgia, and there'll never be a trial there either.
Very interesting. And, you know, we should remind our viewers again, too, the Supreme Court came out with a really revolutionary decision, I would argue, last summer when they ruled that presidents are immune for their official acts.
That's right.
Now, there is some room to argue about what are and what are not official acts.
Correct.
But that was a stunning decision in its breadth. It went in a direction and attracted a majority vote of the Supreme Court to become law that I don't think most legal observers thought they were going to go that far. So is this a legitimate reason to have concerns about how far will a President Trump in a second term push the legal envelope?
Yeah. When I talk to my students, when I talk about the concepts of checks and balances, I say, what are the checks on the presidency? Well, there's the traditional what? Congress can override a presidential veto.
Right.
There is impeachment.
Appropriations. They can refuse to spend money.
Right. There's the political solution, which is not for people to vote for him. And then there's potentially criminal. But what's happened now, he's going into a second term. He's not going to run again. The political solution in terms of public accountability, the electoral connection is gone. The Supreme Court has dramatically weakened the criminal aspect, and we've already seen 2 attempts to impeach him, and there's just not going to be another, and they were unsuccessful, and even if somehow Congress stays in the Democrats' hands, they're not going to move to impeach him a third time either. So you have to worry that the traditional restraints on presidential power have significantly weakened, and this is not just a concern with Donald Trump, but with any president going forward. This was a Supreme Court decision that vastly increased presidential power.
And the implications of this decision are going to long outlast President Trump. At the end of his next and last term, he'll be, 82 years old in 4 years. But hopefully the country goes on and there'll be other presidents in the future where we're going to be facing the same question. Those of us of a certain age, you and I are old enough to remember Watergate.
That's right.
And there was a challenge to how much power did the President of the United States have.
Right.
And the courts fundamentally said nobody's above the law, including the President of the United States. But you also had leaders in Congress like Barry Goldwater and others who stood up, and when it was time for the President to go for abusing his office, he went.
You're right.
And you don't necessarily have that anymore.
Yeah. Back then we still had country above party and separation of powers above party. It's now party above country, party above separation of powers. There isn't a Barry Goldwater in Congress right now. Maybe John McCain was the last Barry Goldwater, if I could sort of use a pun there. But somebody who's going to stand up on that level of principle, or maybe Mitt Romney, as he's exiting out.
But he's leaving.
He's leaving also. And so the checks in the system are dramatically weaker than they were from the Watergate era.
Wow. Well, it shall be very interesting to see what happens. Professor David Schultz, Hamline University and the University of Minnesota Law School, thank you for coming back on Access to Democracy as we dissect the results of the 2024 election.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.